Hey guys, today we're going to be taking a look at Fortnite on the RTX 5090. You can see for the specs for our 5090 over here in GPU-Z. We're using the MSI Gaming X Trio OC version of the card, 32 gigabytes of GDDR7 video memory. Over an MSI Afterburner, you can see we're running on the latest NVIDIA drivers with no manual overclock applied, and pairing with 64 gigabytes of DDR5 RAM and a 9800X3D processor. Let's hop in. And we're going to start off here at full screen 4K on DirectX 12 with maxed out settings using TAA for anti-aliasing. This game does not have DLAA from what I can see, so if we did use DLSS, it drops our 3D resolution. So we're going to use TAA and just slide our 3D resolution up to 100, showing that we are at 100% resolution scale. And this is with all of our ray tracing turned all the way up to epic. So global illumination, Lumen epic, reflections also on epic, and everything else maxed out at epic with hardware ray tracing. And here we are loaded in. You can see, this is an Unreal Engine 5 game, obviously, given that it's Fortnite. So our frame time graph is something that we do want to kind of keep an eye on because I am expecting, unfortunately, for it to be pretty stuttery. I have found that after a bit of gameplay, it tends to smooth out a little bit, but not completely. So we'll keep an eye on that. But here in the little, starting zone here, we're getting right around 90 to 100 FPS. And dropping down here, I'll start counting here and restart once we land again. But as you can see, our 1% lows are pretty bad as we start dropping here. I'm hoping that gets a bit better. It is also like during like sunset type scene, so actually a pretty nice scene for us to kind of check out some of that ray tracing. You could already see on the water those ray tracing effects kind of taking place here. It looks absolutely gorgeous. I really do think Fortnite has come a long way just in terms of the visual fidelity. It looks pretty great. And now that we landed, you can see averaging 80. We'll go ahead and restart counting here just to get a more accurate representation. So in a pretty demanding scene with all these like reflections, getting right around 60 with 1% lows, actually not too bad right now. Sitting at around 50, that's pretty close to our average here. So far it's feeling like a pretty smooth experience, and we'll see if we can get into a bit of combat here. Oh, I did not realize I have a sniper rifle. Oh my god. Still hovering right around 70, definitely a respectable average. Not necessarily what I would consider to be like a high refresh rate experience, but still pretty solid. And our 5090 is only pulling like 440 watts of power on the higher end right now. Now, only that is, a high amount of video memory, or a high amount of wattage, but compared to what the card can pull, it's actually relatively low. Let's go ahead and so we'll start driving around here to see maybe if this potentially lowers our 1% lows, loading into new areas, sitting right around 50 for our 1% lows at the current moment. And even driving around, I'm not really seeing any meaningful dip here. Go ahead and grab our lightsaber here, and even loading in like new areas, going into some of our more intensive effects, all actually holding pretty strongly as far as our FPS average here, right around 70. It's not a super high refresh rate experience, but it's certainly playable here at complete native, maxed out everything here. And as far as the TAA goes for anti-aliasing, when you're at 4K, you don't really need super like impressive anti-aliasing. Those higher resolutions, they kind of do a good enough job kind of making out the edges of the pixels as, wow, okay, that was a pretty major dip in our FPS down into the 40s there. But TAA is pretty suitable when it comes to at least these higher resolutions. Like 4K, you don't really need DLAA anyways. I mean, the game will certainly look sharper with DLAA in general when you're, if you have it. But since we don't even have the option of turning on DLAA, TAA is doing a totally serviceable job for us here. Let's go ahead and hop in a TIE fighter here, see if this makes any sort of meaningful difference in our FPS. And not really, it's still holding right around 70. I'm not 100% sure what caused that dip into the 40s. Let's see if we can fly around a bit and maybe replicate that. Alright, looks like we finally have someone we can shoot at here. And no major drop, even in a bit of, not super exciting combat here, but seems to be holding well. As we go ahead and approach towards water, still not really dipping that much, even with all these reflective, like ray trace reflections here. Seems to be holding pretty strong, right around 70 or 80 FPS. And you can see our frame time graph, while it is still a bit, there is some variance there with some, slight micro stutters that kind of make the game feel like not buttery smooth the way you kind of want, you know, these competitive type games to perform. It's not terrible, honestly. It kind of has smoothed out at least decently. And the game does look absolutely incredible. I mean, Fortnite on complete epic settings with ray tracing and all that, it looks like a totally different game than, you know, when we kind of bump things down. So around 77 FPS average here at completely maxed out native TAA. All right, let's go ahead and bump down now to DLSS quality. So this is just, you know, maybe if you wanted a slight improvement in your FPS without actually, you know, hurting your image quality too bad. We'll see how this kind of looks. And right off the bat, we are getting about 20 or so FPS improvement, now around 90 on our average. And as I die here, averaging right around 90 with DLSS quality. We'll hop in and test that a little bit more. And still on DLSS quality here, and honestly, the image looks pretty similar to TAA, you know, given the fact that TAA is not a super, you know, it's not a super advanced anti-aliasing technology. It doesn't look quite as sharp as something like DLAA. Really, I don't really see a great reason to at least use DLSS quality. You know, DLSS really looks pretty great at higher resolutions. When you're at 1080p or even 1440p, there may be more of a case for playing it native, but unless you have DLAA at 4K, there really isn't much of any of a major, you know, impact when it comes to your actual visual quality or your picture quality that you're getting here just by bumping over to DLSS quality. And we are getting, you know, about, you know, we were getting high 70s most of the time was what I was seeing. So now we're getting into the 100s, 90s, things like that. So it's not a huge performance increase, but it's enough that, you know, if you have maybe like a 120 hertz display, I do think it's probably worth just using that DLSS, getting a bit more of a increase in your performance. Don't really see a super great reason for not doing that. So DLSS quality, if you were to play, you know, max settings, this is probably where I'd land. For me personally, this is enough FPS that, you know, I feel like I'm not at a competitive disadvantage, but it's also not really hurting our image quality whatsoever. It still feels like we're playing at pretty much native 4K here. And you'll notice we are still getting those kind of not super smooth frame time graph here. So I imagine that's going to be the case regardless of the settings that we choose, but it will be something that we kind of keep an eye on. All right, the next setting I want to test here at 4K is back on native TAA, but now with NANA off. So none of the hardware ray tracing. So it is still epic settings. It's just no nanite, so none of that ray tracing turned on. Just so you know, this way we can say how much does that ray tracing really affect our performance, because we were getting around 70 or so with all that stuff on. So here now, still at epic setting, just without that ray tracing, you can see we are getting right off the bat incredibly high FPS compared to what we were getting with the ray tracing on. But we'll come down to some water maybe here and see how that looks. You can see, at least while we're falling, the stutters are still definitely there. And we'll go ahead and begin counting here as we get kind of closer to landing here. So around the water, you can definitely see it's not as visually impressive. There are still reflections. They're just not, you know, those fancy ray trace reflections. But we are now getting, you know, considerably more FPS, like almost like over two times as much FPS. Maybe even 3 times at certain times. So yeah, it's definitely a major improvement, and the game still looks really good. You know, it's not like an ugly looking game with the ray tracing off. It just definitely looks much, much better with the ray tracing on. So I don't know, you know, I would probably prefer to have the ray tracing on and utilize some DLSS, get to around 90 to 100. I think that's probably enough for someone like me, but I can definitely see the case to be made for someone who is, you know, a competitive like player who wants higher FPS and doesn't really need the ray tracing to be on, because it's not really going to give you any sort of competitive advantage to have it on. In fact, I'd imagine some of that ray tracing may even actually give you a slight disadvantage just due to the amount of, you know, things that are happening on screen. It's a bit more of a simple, like clean looking image here, just not quite as visually impressive. But the other thing I'm noticing is that at least the ray tracing, that did not clean up our 1% lows. So that's stuttering, as you can see, both with our 1% lows as well as our frame time graph kind of peaking up and down at times, has not been resolved with the removal of the ray tracing. And the last setting I want to test here at 4K is now on the performance rendering mode, which uses DirectX 11 for our graphics API, 100% 3D resolution with epic view distance and textures. mesh is set to low. And here at performance mode, you can see we're getting an absolutely absurd FPS here. Now, one thing I did notice with performance mode on previous testing is the 1% lows become pretty terrible. So despite the fact that our frame time graph, it looks really flat, if you look closely, there are a bunch of these little peaks. So it's so flat because our FPS is so high, but those little peaks result in all these little micro stutters, and they really are very, very evident if you're like panning the camera around. So while we are getting 500 FPS, if you had a super high refresh rate display, I don't even know if they make 4K displays that are at 500 FPS or 500 hertz rather, you can definitely populate that display. So averaging out right around 500 or so, but these stutters are actually pretty atrocious, and this is with a 9800X 3D, so we really should be giving the game the best chance to kind of perform well. And the other thing, when you're on a 4K display, when you have like these lower quality visuals like we have here on performance, they really do look quite ugly, if I'm being completely honest. And you'll also notice, our 1% lows are staying down, so they're consistent. Even if we stop counting, start again, those 1% lows will very, very quickly dip all the way back into the 20s. So I wouldn't really go for performance settings here personally. I just think that the performance settings at 4K seem kind of silly. I think performance is not really what you want to be on, even if you are like a competitive type player. Those 1% lows are just going to give you an absolutely terrible experience, and you don't want, frame drops and like these little micro stutters when you're trying to, win something like a battle royale game. I think the performance settings are much more for people with like super low end hardware. It'd make more sense to me there if you had, just absolutely like out of date hardware and you just want to be able to play the game. That's where I might be able to see, 1% lows like this being okay, like a good trade-off to get a higher, more playable FPS. But here, in my opinion, there isn't really a great reason to get 500 FPS if you're sacrificing your, your smoothness and your 1% lows and your stuttering increases so much. It just doesn't seem like an appropriate trade-off in my opinion. All right, now moving over to 1440p, and since we're already here on this DirectX 11 API with the performance rendering model, let's go ahead and stay here. So we're doing the same settings here, performance mode at 1440p, and I really expect this to be much the same experience, a high FPS, but a pretty choppy experience. So we'll see how this looks. And launching in here, you can see we are getting pretty much like the same range of FPS as we're getting in 4K. Doesn't actually seem too different. As you can see, our GPU utilization is pretty low to start out here. That will probably climb, I'd imagine, as we actually land and get going doing some actual like Fortnite type activities here. But we'll go ahead and start counting and see if those 1% lows and the stuttering is still there, or if it's a bit better at 1440p. And as you can see right away, we're getting some pretty noticeable stuttering. Now, I don't want to just totally focus on the chart. It says 22 FPS, and what's more important than just like a number showing us that we're getting a bad experience is the actual experience itself. And I can say that, the stutters, sometimes you'll go like maybe like 10-15 seconds without a stutter, but as soon as you kind of do get a stutter, it pretty much just kind of like wrecks the whole experience. Let's go ahead and we'll see how this looks like flying around in a X-Wing. I actually have not flown one of these yet. And we are getting, it's a very high FPS. Our 1% lows are going up a bit now here into the 60s for a moment there. But a 60 FPS 1% low when you're averaging 500 FPS is pretty terrible. That's the equivalent of having like 100 FPS and having 10 FPS as your 1% lows. Just shows that we are dipping down into, pretty much the game freezing or stopping for just like these really brief periods of time that just result in a really inconsistent and kind of just like not great experience. But I won't spend too much time here on the performance model, just due to the fact that I do think that these are meant more for people with lower end hardware as opposed to people with higher end hardware who want to get super high FPS. But I don't really see a great purpose for using this particular model on a 5090. All right, we're back now on DirectX 12, and we're going to be going for the max settings here. So using TAA still here for anti-aliasing should be good enough. Hopefully doesn't look too bad at 1440p. 100% resolution scale, and Nanite with Epic virtual shadows and Lumen global illuminations, as well as reflections. So these are completely maxed out settings at native resolution here. Alright, so as we begin to jump in, as a reminder, this was right around high 70s, maybe 80s, between like 60 and 80 FPS at 4K. So we are getting a pretty meaningful bump just by bumping our resolution down to 1440p. So honestly, 1440p, if you have a 5090, you're going to be having a great experience in a lot of games, and it seems like Fortnite is just another one of those. And as you can see, that 1% low issue that we were having, you know, the game itself on Unreal Engine 5 is just like not super great when it comes to 1% lows and actually just like the smoothness of the frames, but it is considerably better here on DirectX 12 when compared to those performance settings on DirectX 11. You know, I do think Fortnite needs to figure out a way to just have like a super consistent experience for those competitive players. But of course, you know, here at complete max settings with all this ray tracing, the game looks really, really amazing. If we go ahead and dive into a bit of water here, you can just see these reflections on the water are absolutely gorgeous. I mean, the game looks great. I do think Fortnite looks pretty amazing when you kind of go in here and just crank every setting. And really, for a player like me, you know, I don't think there's any reason to even use any upscaling here. The game looks good. TAA is actually performing pretty well, providing us a pretty nice image. It's not too soft or anything like that. And as you can see, you know, someone like me, I'm not super competitive. I'm able to, you know, perform how I would like normally. But for my money, I do think that, you know, you're better off getting a smoother frame rate with less dips than just getting like a higher average here. So definitely a real solid experience here at native. Around 120 FPS on our average. Looks like we're kind of landing here. But let's go ahead and just apply, again, just that quality upscaling while retaining these high settings. And we'll begin running around here. I'm noticing definitely a bump in our FPS, but also, honestly, the image quality, it's arguable. It may even look a bit better here with DLSS when compared to TAA native. Again, I really wish that there was just a way to just use DLAA, you know, the DLSS with 100% resolution scale, but and there may be a way to do that with editing some config settings or something like that, but I typically don't really like changing, you know, due to the fact that it's a multiplayer game and you do risk the run the risk of being banned or having some sort of issue if you do come in here and change DLSS models or anything like that. So I don't really, you know, wouldn't really love to do that. But here at native, or not native, sorry, at quality upscaling here, still getting a really, really solid experience. About a 10 FPS increase so far. Of course, some of that can be attributed to just different scenes we're in, so it could be a bit higher. But really, you know, due to how good the actual image looks, I don't really see a great reason for not utilizing a bit of this upscaling. So averaging out here right around, looks like maybe 6 FPS higher on our average, but it feels higher than that. And our 1% lows, while they're not perfect, and that I don't think they will be perfect in any of the settings that we test here today, they're definitely not terrible, and it does feel like a relatively smooth experience. All right, next setting here, back at 1440p native TAA. I'll just test this temporarily. I think I'm going to move down to DLSS quality pretty soon here, because I actually do think even quality looks quite a bit better here. And we're still in epic settings, but just with that ray tracing off. So nanite is turned off here, but everything else is still set to epic. All right, starting off here now with that ray tracing turned off, you can see obviously we get a pretty significant bump here. We'll begin counting, we'll restart in a second here, but close to like 300 FPS, pretty absurd amount of FPS here at 1440p native. And while the 1% lows and the stuttering is definitely still evident so far, it is getting better as we go and, you know, get a higher FPS. Coming down to the water, you can kind of see again those effects kind of not quite as prevalent as they were with ray tracing. The water still looks fine. I don't think it looks like terrible or anything like that. Just not quite as good as we get a pretty major stutter there. But you can see, you know, the grass, like all these like nice shadows and everything. Everything still looks really solid in my opinion. And we'll go ahead and begin again, restart counting our FPS just to see right around where we're at here. And remember, we're getting around 120 FPS on our average with everything cranked with ray tracing. So just turning off ray tracing gives us over double the FPS. So it just goes to show how demanding ray tracing can be. Now, for many people, you know, maybe myself included, it's typically not worth, as we go ahead and get killed there, we'll hop back in here, but it may not be worth, you know, the performance hit, but it my opinion, 120 FPS is already a really solid place to be in. So coming down into like the 120s coming from 300 is not really the end of the world in my opinion. I actually don't really need 300 FPS. You know, I'm not like that competitive, but definitely if you are into competitive Fortnite, I would still say that, you know, ray tracing is probably off the table. It's not really probably worth the performance hit that you are actually going to be suffering to turn that ray tracing on. So we'll hop in a little bit here and play a bit more with these ray trace settings turned off. And landing into a new match here, you can see we're pretty much getting right around the same FPS. So definitely a real solid experience here. Now, what I would like to see is just turning on quality DLSS here with ray tracing off, which again, in my opinion, looks essentially the same, maybe even a bit better. And while we aren't getting like miles better FPS, it is better enough, and in my opinion, the image quality looks good enough that I would probably rather play here. Man. Okay, so it's not going to make you a Fortnite pro or anything. As you can see, I'm still terrible, but yeah, definitely a real solid experience here. You have a lot of options at 1440p. You can really, you know, play with a lot of them and see where you like to land. And our 1% lows are also much better here, around 140. Seems like the frame time graph is a bit more stable as we kind of bump down in resolution. Now, not that I think anyone with a 5090 should be playing at 1080p, but let's just see. 1080p, we're on this performance DirectX 11 mode, so this should give us the highest possible FPS here, if not for some pretty terrible stuttering, unless that gets addressed for some reason. So this is just performance mode, native resolution at 1080p. And it'll be interesting to see if our 9800X3D can even keep up with the amount of frames that we're going to be producing here, but we'll see. All right, here at performance settings, you can see we're getting incredibly high FPS into the 700s, even 800s as we touched there for a moment there. But as you can see, our GPU utilization is incredibly low. So that is just indicative of the fact that our processor is not really able to keep up with the delivering of the frames. But if you're ever curious, you know, most powerful GPU on the market right now, what can it do at 1080p with just the most bare bones of settings? You know, it's around 700 or so at times. Now we're into the 600s. It's still not going to be a super great experience. And honestly, our average is not really that much different, if I remember correctly, than when we were at 1440p and 4K. So it definitely seems like, you know, our graphics card wants to be putting out more frames than it's actually capable of. It will definitely be interesting to, you know, come back, revisit this when we actually have processors that are actually capable of kind of handling these higher frame rates. Because here, you know, our GPU utilization is only 30%. So, you know, maybe if we had a super strong processor, like I don't know if the 9950 X3D, the one step up of the 9800 X3D in certain situations, you know, maybe we would even be touching 1000 FPS. But, you know, me personally, I've never owned a 1000 hertz monitor. I don't even know if those really exist. I think the highest that I'm really aware of are like 360 hertz. I've personally never played on anything higher than my current monitor, which is a 240 hertz monitor, and even I have a kind of hard time telling the difference when we get like near 200 FPS. It's kind of gets pretty tricky telling the difference between 200 and like, oh man, but difference between like 200 and 240 in my opinion. Those 40 frames, they may as well not be there because I can't even tell the difference personally. But yeah, super high FPS here, if not for a pretty terrible experience with our 1% lows. All right, and the only other setting here I want to test at 1080p is just completely maxed out everything. So we're going to stick with TAA for now. And this is totally epic, Lumen epic everything. So hardware ray tracing set to max here. All right, so starting off here in the battle bus, you can see we're getting around 190 on our FPS. Pretty solid performance here. Of course, this is 1080p, so not a resolution that I think many people with a 5090 will be playing at. But, you know, then again, if the Steam hardware survey is anything to go by, most players are still at 1080p. We also switched out our glider for this X-Wing. Pretty nifty. And as we begin kind of running around, go ahead and restart counting our FPS. We're sitting right around 120 or so. It's actually not that much higher than we were on 1440p. Our GPU utilization is also kind of low, like hovering around 95, 96, with our CPU utilization very high too. So we'll play a little bit here just to ensure that, you know, everything gets loaded in properly and that we are actually getting, you know, accurate numbers. Let's go ahead and grab our lightsaber here. So yeah, around like 130 or so on our average here. Pretty good, not terrible by any means. Now with TAA at 1080p, it doesn't look amazing. So let's go ahead, and I did want to just test out one additional feature, and that is using TSR Epic at the native resolution. So this does give us pretty much, this is like similar to DLAA, where this is now our anti-aliasing solution, does give us a slight dip in our FPS performance, but while giving us a much cleaner and sharper image. So honestly, if I were to be playing at 1080p, I'd probably use this TSR option. This does look quite a bit sharper when compared to TAA. So definitely real solid performance here. Everything maxed out, of course, and honestly, the picture quality here with TSR looks absolutely incredible. Let's go ahead and fly around a little bit to see how that feels. So definitely a really clean looking image here at 1080p. Alright, that's been it. Fortnite on the 5090. Of course, Fortnite is not a super intensive game, but it is a game that, unfortunately, due to Unreal Engine 5, has a lot of these pretty terrible stutters. So, the 5090, not that it should be a surprise to anyone, but you are going to be able to get a really great experience regardless of resolution. 4K, 1440p, 1080p, you really have a lot of options to kind of go in and choose from. And I hope that they kind of address those stutters at some point, but they're definitely still prevalent here. And you can definitely even use it, like right now with all this ray tracing, and get a real solid experience. If you're okay with turning off the ray tracing, you'll get even better experience. But yeah, that's been it. Thank you guys so much for watching. I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye-bye.